Look at it. Really look. On your screen now, photograph taken 48 hours ago by a commercial imaging satellite. A thin ribbon of water, barely 21 miles across at its narrowest point. From space it appears almost insignificant. A scratch. A crack in the coastline where the desert meets the sea. You could miss it if you weren't looking for it. And yet, this scratch, this narrow passage, this 21-mile gap between the rocky coast of Iran and the mountainous peninsula of Oman has brought the world to its knees. 20%. 1/5 of all the oil consumed by humanity. 85 million barrels every day. The lifeblood of the global economy, the fuel that powers your morning commute, the plastic in your phone, the fertilizer that grows your food, the jet fuel that carries your packages across oceans, all of it must pass through this gate. 3 weeks ago, this waterway was open, invisible, taken for granted. Tankers moved through it with the regularity of a heartbeat at it to 100 vessels per day, carrying the black gold from the wells of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the Emirates to the refineries of Asia, Europe, and America. The global economy inhaled that oil, transformed it into motion and warmth and light, and never gave the Strait of Hormuz a second thought. Until now. Today the strait is closed, blockaded, choked. Iranian Revolutionary Guard fast attack craft small, maneuverable, deadly patrol these waters now. Their guns are trained on any vessel that attempts passage without permission. Their missiles track the supertankers that sit at anchor, laden with oil, unable to move. The world has watched, helpless, as prices have surged past $126 per barrel. Gas stations from Los Angeles to London have begun to ration fuel. Stock markets have convulsed. Airlines have canceled flights, and 20,000 mariners from 50 nations sit in limbo in the Gulf of Oman, their ships anchored in international waters, unable to move forward, unwilling to turn back, caught in a geopolitical standoff that threatens to plunge the world into recession. How did we get here? How did a narrow waterway, known to ancient mariners as the Gate of Tears, become the jugular vein of the global economy? How did a land of desert and mountains, of scorching summers and freezing winters, give rise to one of the world's greatest civilizations? How did a people who invented human rights, who pioneered irrigation, who created some of the most beautiful art and poetry the world has ever known, come to hold the world in such a grip? And what does this moment tell us about the deeper currents of history, about empire and religion, about trade and faith, about the eternal human struggle to control the narrow places where geography and destiny collide? To understand the crisis of this moment, the blockade, the tankers, the 20,000 stranded souls, we must travel back through the mists of time, back 5,000 years, to when the first civilizations rose in the shadow of the Zagros Mountains. Back to when the concept of Iran was not yet born, but the land was already ancient, already complex, already connected to the wider world through trade routes that crossed mountains and deserts and seas. We must begin where all Persian stories begin, in the highlands, among the mountains, where the wind speaks with the voices of ancestors and the earth itself remembers the footsteps of kings, where water is more precious than gold, and the ability to channel it, to preserve it, to make the desert bloom, is the highest art. This is the story of the strait. But to tell it properly, to understand why this waterway matters, why it has been contested for millennia, why the world is held hostage by its closure, we must first tell the story of the land that guards it. The story of Iran, the story of Persia, the story of a civilization that has endured, adapted, and influenced the world for 5,000 years, from the dawn of recorded history to the crisis that confronts us today. This is that story. 7,000 years ago, before the pyramids rose on the banks of the Nile, before the walls of Jericho were built, before the first cities of Mesopotamia had even been imagined, people lived here. In the Zagros Mountains, where the Iranian plateau buckles and folds like fabric caught in the geological machinery of continental collision, early farmers discovered that wheat and barley could be coaxed from this stony soil. They built mud brick villages on terraced hillsides, clinging to slopes that would terrify modern builders. They learned to divert mountain streams into channels, qanats, they would call them, that tunneled through rock for miles, emerging as sweet water in the valleys below. These were not the grand civilizations of history books. These were people scraping a living from a demanding land. But the land in turn demanded something of them. It demanded cooperation, ingenuity, a willingness to shape the world rather than merely endure it. In the Zagros, you could not survive alone. You needed your neighbors to help maintain the irrigation channels. You needed your clan to defend against raiders. You needed your tribe to trade with, to marry into, to bury your dead beside. And so, slowly, complexity emerged. By 4000 BCE, the people of the Iranian plateau had learned to work copper. They mined it in the mountains. They smelted it in clay furnaces. They traded this metal with the cities rising in Mesopotamia to the west, or Uruk, Legashiks, changing ore for grain, for textiles, for the luxury goods that only complex societies could produce. The mountains that isolated them also protected them, and the passes that pierced those mountains became corridors of exchange, carrying not just goods but ideas, technologies, stories. The first great civilization to emerge on this plateau called itself Elam. The name appears in Sumerian texts from 2700 BCE, one of the earliest mentions of Iran in recorded history. The Elamites built their capital at Susa, in the fertile lowlands where the Zagros meet the plains, where the earth is rich and water is plentiful. They developed a writing system, adapting the cuneiform script of their Mesopotamian neighbors, but using it to express their own language, unrelated to any other known tongue. They constructed monumental architectures, girats, temples, palaces. They raised armies and waged war against their Mesopotamian neighbors, sometimes conquering them, sometimes being conquered in turn. But the Elamites were not Persian in the way we understand the term today. They spoke a language that has no known relatives. They worshipped gods with names like Inshushanak and Napirisha and Kiririsha. They were, in many ways, a bridge civilization, connecting the emerging cultures of the Indus Valley with the city-states of Mesopotamia, funneling trade and ideas through the mountain passes they controlled. They were among the first to understand what we now take for granted, that control of trade routes means power, that the narrow places, mountain passes, river crossings, coastal straits are where wealth concentrates. And trade in those ancient days moved by water where it could. The Persian Gulf, calm and navigable, offered a highway between civilizations. The Elamites controlled the northern shores. Their merchants sailed to the islands of Bahrain, to the mouth of the Indus, to the distant shores of Oman and beyond. They traded in carnelian and lapis lazuli, in timber and textiles, in the pearls that were already being harvested from the Gulf's warm waters. They were among the first to understand the strategic importance of maritime choke points, the narrow channels through which all commerce must pass, where tolls could be extracted and control exerted. But empires rise and fall. The Elamites, for all their sophistication, could not withstand the endless pressure from Mesopotamia. They were conquered by the Babylonians, by the Assyrians, by the Neo-Babylonians. Their cities were sacked, their temples destroyed, their people scattered. And then, in 539 BCE, a new power swept across the plateau, a power that would not merely conquer, but transform. A power that would give the world a new word for greatness, a new model of governance, a new understanding of what an empire could be. Cyrus, the name hangs in the air, resonant with history. Cyrus the Great, king of Anshan, king of Persia, king of Media, king of the universe. He was born, according to legend, of humble origins. The stories say his grandfather, the Median king Astyages, dreamed that his daughter Mandane would give birth to a son who would overthrow him. Terrified by this prophecy, Astyages ordered the infant Cyrus exposed on a mountainside, left to die of exposure or be eaten by wolves. But a shepherd named Mithridates, whose own child had been stillborn, found the infant, raised him as his own, and kept the secret. And when the boy grew to manhood, his true identity revealed itself through his bearing, his intelligence, his undeniable charismatic qualities that could not be hidden, that marked him as destined for greatness. Whether this story is true or merely the myth-making of later ages, we cannot say with certainty. But we know this: in 559 BCE, Cyrus became king of a small Persian territory called Anshan, a vassal state of the Median Empire. Within 20 years, he had conquered the Median Empire itself, the Lydian Empire of Croesus in Anatolia, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire with its magnificent capital at Babylon. He had created the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to the Hindu Kush, from the Persian Gulf to the Oxus River. And he did something unprecedented, something that would echo through history, influencing governance from Rome to India, and eventually reaching the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, shaping the policies of nations 25 centuries later. He practiced tolerance. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered in 1879 by archaeologists excavating Babylon and now housed in the British Museum, records how Cyrus allowed the peoples he conquered to maintain their own customs, their own religions, their own laws. He freed the Jews from Babylonian captivity, ending the exile that had begun with Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem, and helped them rebuild their temple in their holy city. He restored the gods of Babylon to their shrines, reversing the policies of his predecessors, who had carried off sacred statues as trophies of war. He governed not through terror and forced assimilation, but through inclusion and respect for diversity. This was not merely benevolence, though Cyrus may well have been a man of genuine religious feeling. It was strategy. Cyrus understood what so many conquerors before and since have failed to grasp: that empires held together by force alone are fragile things, constantly vulnerable to rebellion and fragmentation. But an empire where diverse peoples see their own interests aligned with the center, where their gods are respected, their customs honored, their elites incorporated into governance, that empire could endure. That empire could flourish. That empire could transform the world. And flourish it did. Under Cyrus and his successors, the Achaemenid Empire created the first true world economy. Standardized coinage, the gold daric and the silver siglos facilitated trade across thousands of miles. A royal road stretching 1,700 miles from Sardis in western Anatolia to Susa in Elam, with way stations every 20 miles and fresh horses allowing messages to travel the distance in a week, enabled rapid communication. A postal system, the Angarion, connected the provinces to the center. A professional bureaucracy drawn from across the empire, administered justice and collected taxes with unprecedented efficiency. But what concerns us most, as we trace the story toward the Strait of Hormuz, is the maritime dimension of this empire. For the Achaemenids were not merely land conquerors. They were masters of the sea, understanding as only great powers can that control of trade routes requires control of waterways. Cyrus's son Cambyses conquered Egypt in 525 BCE, extending Persian power to the Nile and the Mediterranean. His successor, Darius the Great, extended that power across the Aegean Sea, subduing the Greek cities of Ionia and attempting to incorporate the Greek mainland into the empire. Darius built a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea, an engineering marvel that anticipated the Suez Canal by 2 millennia and allowed ships to sail from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean without circumnavigating Africa. He sent a fleet to explore the coast of India, establishing contact with the Indus Valley civilization. He established the first regular maritime trade route between the Indus and the Persian Gulf, carrying goods that would eventually pass through the Strait of Hormuz to markets across the known world. And here, in the reign of Darius, we find the first explicit mention of the region that would become so crucial to our story: the old Persian inscriptions at Persepolis. The ceremonial capital Darius built in the Iranian heartland lists the territories of the empire. Among them, Hindush, India, Gadara, Gandhara, Dadagush, Satajidia, and the lands along the Persian Gulf, that narrow sea that the Greeks called the Red Sea and that Iranians knew simply as the Pars Sea, the Sea of Persia. Darius understood what geography had decreed. The Zagros Mountains formed a formidable wall down the western edge of the Iranian plateau, making overland transport to the Mediterranean difficult and expensive. To move goods from the interior to the wider world, one had to go south, the Gulf, and to exit the Gulf to reach the Indian Ocean and the rich markets of India and beyond. One had to pass through a narrow channel between the Iranian coast and the Arabian Peninsula, the Strait. Even then, 25 centuries before supertankers and cryptocurrency tolls, before the global economy and its vulnerabilities, the Strait of Hormuz was a bottleneck, a gate, a place where geography concentrated power. Whoever controlled the lands on either side controlled the flow of trade between east and west. Darius established naval bases along the Iranian coast. He maintained a fleet of triremes warships with 3 banks of oars that could project power across the Gulf and beyond. He ensured that Persian authority extended not just across land but across water. The empire Darius built was, in many ways, the apogee of ancient Persian civilization. At its height, it encompassed approximately 50 million people, roughly 44% of the world's population at that time. It was, by any measure, the first superpower, the first empire to grapple with the challenges of governing a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual domain on a continental scale. And then, like all superpowers, it overreached. In 490 BCE, Darius sent an expedition across the Aegean to punish Athens for supporting the Ionian revolt. The result? The Battle of Marathon, where a smaller Greek force defeated the Persian invaders, killing thousands and sending the survivors fleeing to their ships. In 480 BCE, Darius' son Xerxes assembled one of the largest invasion forces in ancient history, according to the Greek historian Herodotus. Over 2 million men, though modern historians suggest a more modest but still staggering figure of perhaps 200,000 soldiers, with a fleet of over 1,000 ships. They bridged the Hellespont with boats. They marched through Thrace, through Macedonia, through Thessaly. They met the Greeks at Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held them off for 3 days. At Salamis, where the Greek fleet destroyed the Persian navy. At Plataea, where the Greek infantry shattered the Persian army. The Greeks won, not because they were more numerous, the Persians vastly outnumbered them, but because they were fighting for their freedom against an empire they perceived as tyrannical. The myth of Persian despotism, largely Greek propaganda, but potent nonetheless, took root in Western consciousness. The barbarian East, luxurious and corrupt, effeminate and servile, versus the virtuous, democratic, manly West. This binary, this opposition between Europe and Asia, between freedom and despotism, would shape Western thought for 2 millennia, influencing everything from the Renaissance rediscovery of Greece to the modern clash of civilizations. But empires do not fall from a single defeat, however humiliating. The Achaemenids endured for another century and a half after Salamis. They continued to administer their vast territories with remarkable efficiency. They continued to tax the trade that flowed through the Gulf, through the Strait, toward the markets of the Mediterranean world. They continued to build palaces, roads, irrigation systems, leaving monuments that still inspire awe today. Yet the seeds of decline had been planted. Provincial governors, the satraps, accumulated power and wealth. becoming hereditary rulers in all but name. The central authority weakened, court intrigues multiplied, the treasury was depleted by constant warfare and royal extravagance, and in the rugged highlands of Macedonia on the northwestern fringe of the Greek world, a young king was preparing to fulfill what he believed was his divine destiny. Alexander. In 334 BCE, Alexander the Great crossed the Hellespont into Asia with an army of Macedonians and Greeks, perhaps 40,000 men. Within 4 years, he had defeated the Persian armies at the Granicus River, at Issus, at Gaugamela. In 330 BCE, he burned Persepolis whether in a drunken rage, as the ancient stories claim, or as deliberate policy to symbolize the end of the Persian Empire, we will never know. The Achaemenid Empire, which had stood for 2 centuries as the greatest power the world had ever known, crumbled, but Alexander's empire died with him in 323 BCE, victim of fever in Babylon at the age of 32. His generals, the Diadochi, carved up his conquests like carrion birds. Persia fell to the Seleucids, who ruled as foreign occupiers, establishing Greek cities, promoting Greek culture and language, importing Greek colonists, but never truly integrating with the land they governed. For over a century, Iran was a Hellenistic kingdom, connected to the Mediterranean world, but estranged from its own deep history. 2 centuries passed. Then, from the northeast, came a new Iranian revival. The Parthians, originally nomadic horsemen from the steppes of Central Asia, speaking an Iranian language, practicing Iranian customs, seized control of the Iranian plateau in the 3rd century BCE. They were warriors more than administrators, but they understood the strategic importance of the trade routes that crossed their territory. They controlled the Silk Road, the great artery connecting China to the Mediterranean. They taxed the caravans that carried Chinese silk to Roman markets, making their capital at Ctesiphon one of the richest cities in the world. And they maintained the maritime routes through the Persian Gulf, ensuring that the luxury goods of the East, spices, pearls, textiles, precious stones, continued to flow through the Strait of Hormuz toward the markets of the Roman Empire. The Parthians ruled for nearly 500 years, from the mid-3rd century BCE to the early 3rd century CE. They fought the Romans to a standstill at Carrhae in 53 BCE, destroying the army of Crassus and capturing the legionary standards, a humiliation that haunted Roman consciousness for decades. They resisted Roman expansion into Mesopotamia, defeating repeated invasions by emperors from Trajan to Macrinus. They preserved Iranian independence of a sort, while absorbing influences from both East and West, creating a cosmopolitan culture that blended Iranian, Greek, and Central Asian elements. But the Parthians, for all their military prowess, never achieved the cultural synthesis of the Achaemenids. They left few monuments. Their capital at Ctesiphon has largely vanished beneath the alluvial plains of Iraq, leaving only the magnificent arch of Tak Khasra as testimony to their achievement. They were, in the end, placeholders, maintaining Iranian independence until a new dynasty could emerge to truly revive the glories of the past, to reconnect with the deep traditions of Iranian civilization, and to establish a new Persian empire that would rival the Achaemenid achievement. That dynasty emerged in 224 CE. Ardashir, a vassal king from the province of Fars Persis, the heartland of the old Achaemenid Empire, overthrew the last Parthian king Artabanus IV in battle and established the Sassanid Empire. He claimed descent from the Achaemenids, fabricating a genealogy that connected him to the ancient kings. He restored Zoroastrianism as the state religion, reversing the religious pluralism of the Parthian period. He reconquered the territories that had been lost to Rome and Central Asian invaders, and he turned his attention once again to the sea. The Sassanids understood, as Darius had understood before them, that control of the Persian Gulf meant control of wealth, that maritime commerce was the lifeblood of empire, and that the Strait of Hormuz was the key to that commerce. They established naval bases at the mouth of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They sent expeditions to the east coast of Arabia, seeking to control the pearl fisheries and the trade routes that connected the Gulf to the Indian Ocean. They contested control of the strait with the Kingdom of Hormuz, a small but strategically vital state that had grown rich from the trade that passed through its waters. The Kingdom of Hormuz, which gives the strait its name, emerged sometime in the 10th or 11th century CE, though its origins are shrouded in legend. Its rulers, originally perhaps from the Persian mainland, established themselves first on the island of Jarun, modern Achaemenid, later on the island of Hormuz itself, a barren volcanic rock that offered a perfect natural fortress. They built a fabulous city, described by medieval travelers as one of the wonders of the world, a cosmopolitan emporium where merchants from India, China, Arabia, Persia, and Africa gathered to exchange their goods. Marco Polo, passing through in the 13th century on his way back from China, called Hormuz a noble city and a great port of trade, where merchants come from all parts of the world with their goods. The Kingdom of Hormuz survived by playing larger powers against each other. When the Sassanids were strong, they acknowledged Sassanid overlordship. When the Arab Muslims conquered Persia in the 7th century, they converted to Islam and accepted Arab sovereignty. When the Mongols swept through in the 13th century, they submitted to the Ilkhans, the Mongol dynasty that ruled Iran. They were, above all, pragmatists. The trade must flow, they understood, and whoever controlled the narrow waterway between the Persian coast and Arabia, the 21 miles that separated the island of Hormuz from the mainland, controlled the trade. They extracted tolls. They provided pilots for the dangerous navigation. They stored goods in their warehouses. They grew rich on the commerce that passed through their hands. This is the deep history of the strait, long before oil, before supertankers, before the global economy with its instant communications and just-in-time supply chains. This narrow channel was a choke point of civilization. The pearls of the Gulf, harvested by divers who could hold their breath for minutes at a time. The spices of Malacca and the Moluccas, carried by Arab and Indian dhows across the Indian Ocean. The silks of China, transported overland on the Silk Road or by sea through the strait. The gold of Africa, the ivory, the slaves, all of it passed through these waters. All of it paid tribute to whoever held the shores. And now, as we move into the medieval period, we must understand how the religious and cultural transformations of that era would reshape not just Iran, but the entire region around the strait. For the coming of Islam would change everything. It would create a new civilization, a new identity, a new relationship between the land of Persia and the waters that bordered it. It would establish patterns of thought and governance that persist to this day, shaping the ideology of the Revolutionary Guards who now patrol the strait, influencing the worldview of the Ayatollahs who command them, determining the relationship between Iran and the wider world. Before Islam there was fire, not the destructive fire of conquest, but the sacred fire of worship. For over a millennium, from the time of Zoroaster, perhaps as early as 1500 BCE, perhaps as late as 600 BCE, until the Arab conquests of the 7th century CE, the dominant faith of the Iranian plateau was Zoroastrianism. And at the heart of Zoroastrian practice, in every temple and shrine, burned an eternal flame, Zoroaster Zarathustra in the old Iranian tongue. Zartate in modern Persian was a prophet who lived somewhere in the eastern Iranian world, perhaps in Bactria, perhaps on the steppes of Central Asia, perhaps in the mountains of eastern Iran. The dates of his life are uncertain, lost in the mists of antiquity, but his message is preserved in the Gathas, hymns of extraordinary poetic power that form the oldest part of the Zoroastrian scripture, the Avesta. He preached a radical monotheism in a world of polytheistic tribalism. There was one supreme deity, Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, the creator of all that is good. And there was an opposing force, Angra, the destructive spirit, the source of all evil, death, and chaos. Between them, the cosmos hung in eternal tension, a battleground of moral forces that would continue until the end of time. This was dualism, not the simple good versus evil of later traditions, but a complex philosophical system in which human beings had agency, responsibility, moral choice. Every action, every word, every thought mattered. Every choice tipped the balance toward creation or destruction, toward Usha truth, order, righteousness, or toward drudgeries, chaos, evil. Zoroaster taught that the world was not merely to be endured, but to be perfected. Through good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, human beings could assist Ahura Mazda in the cosmic struggle against chaos. They could hasten the eventual triumph of good, the renovation of the universe, the final defeat of evil. It is difficult to overstate the influence of these ideas on world civilization. The concepts of heaven and hell, of a final judgment, of a savior figure who would come at the end of time to redeem the world. All of these appear in Zoroastrianism centuries before they emerge in the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Some scholars argue that Judaism absorbed Zoroastrian concepts during the Babylonian exile, when the Jewish elite encountered Iranian civilization. Others see the influence in early Christianity, in Gnosticism, in Manichaeism, in the mystical traditions of Islam. The very idea that history has a direction, a purpose, an end-time goal, that human actions contribute to a cosmic narrative of redemption, may be Zoroastrian in origin, but for the people of the Iranian plateau, Zoroastrianism was not merely a set of theological propositions or philosophical abstractions. It was a way of life, shaping their ethics, their governance, their relationship with the natural world, their understanding of death and what lay beyond. The king ruled by divine favor, but he was bound by the principles of us, truth, order, righteousness. The empire was not merely a political entity, but a cosmic project, a partnership between human and divine to maintain the harmony of creation against the forces of chaos. The fire temples, with their eternal flames fed by sandalwood and frankincense, dotted the landscape from Bactria to Anatolia. The greatest of them at Farnbag, Adar Gushnasp, and Adar Berzanmir were pilgrimage sites as important as Mecca or Jerusalem would become for later faiths. The Magi, the priestly caste from which we get the word magic, preserved sacred texts, performed complex rituals, maintained the boundary between the clean and the unclean, the orderly and the chaotic. They tended the sacred fire, the symbol of Ahura Mazda's presence, ensuring that it never went out. And Zoroastrianism shaped Persian art, literature, and science in profound ways. The Avesta, the sacred scripture, contains not only hymns and rituals, but also cosmological speculations, ethical teachings, legal codes, and medical knowledge. The Shahnameh, the great epic of Persian literature written by Ferdowsi around 1000 CE, 1,000 years after the Arab conquest, still breathes with Zoroastrian spirit, its heroes fighting for Iran, for Asha, for the light against the dark, for civilization against chaos. The very concept of Iran as a civilizational idea, a moral and cultural identity, has Zoroastrian roots, but by the 7th century CE, Zoroastrianism was in decline. The Sassanid Empire, which had promoted the faith as a state religion, had grown rigid and hierarchical. The priestly caste had become corrupt, accumulating wealth and power at the expense of the faithful. The faith had fragmented into competing sects, each claiming to possess the true interpretation of Zoroaster's message. And the empire itself was exhausted by centuries of war with Byzantium, by plague, by economic disruption, by the endless struggle to maintain control over vast territories. In 633 CE, Arab armies crossed into Mesopotamia. By 651, the last Sassanid king, Yazdegerd III, was dead, murdered by a miller in the city of Merv as he fled eastward toward China, seeking aid that would never come. The empire that had stood for 4 centuries, that had seen itself as the heir to Cyrus and Darius, the guardian of Iranian civilization and Zoroastrian faith, was no more. But conquest is not conversion. The Arab rulers initially had little interest in spreading Islam to their new subjects. They were a small minority, warriors camped in garrison cities, content to tax the local populations and live off the surplus of the ancient civilizations they had conquered. Zoroastrianism persisted. Fire temples continued to burn. The Magi continued their rituals. The Iranian elite, those who had served the Sassanid state, adapted to the new reality while maintaining their cultural identity. Yet slowly, over generations, the balance shifted. Islam offered something that Zoroastrianism, in its late Sassanid form, could not: equality. In theory at least, all Muslims were equal before God, regardless of ethnicity or social status. The Arab tribal distinctions that had mattered in the early days of the conquest gave way to a universal religious identity. For the merchants seeking to rise in the world, the peasants seeking protection from arbitrary taxation, the intellectuals seeking patronage, conversion offered tangible benefits. For the ambitious, the pious, the discontented, Islam was a path forward. And Islam offered something else, a universalism that matched the universalism of the empire. Zoroastrianism was, inescapably, the faith of the Iranians, tied to a specific people and territory. Islam was the faith of the world, transcending ethnicity and nation. To become Muslim was to join a transnational community that stretched from Spain to India, from Central Asia to East Africa. It was to participate in the most dynamic civilization of the medieval period, to have access to its networks of learning, its courts and markets, its pilgrimage routes and scholarly connections. By the 9th century, Islam was the dominant faith of the Iranian plateau, but it was not the Islam of Arabia. It was Persian Islam, a synthesis of Arab religion and Iranian culture that would reshape the Islamic world in profound ways. The Persian language, written now in the Arabic script but retaining its essential structure and vocabulary, became a major literary language. The Shahnameh, composed by Ferdowsi around 1000 CE, was a deliberate act of cultural preservation, a massive epic recounting the history of Iran from creation to the Arab conquest, written in a purified Persian with minimal Arabic loanwords. It was, in essence, a claim: we may be Muslims, but we are still Iranians. We have not forgotten who we were. We have not abandoned our heritage. We have incorporated it, transformed it, made it part of a new synthesis, and Persian scholars reshaped Islamic thought in every field. Al-Razi, the physician and philosopher, who wrote over 200 books on medicine, alchemy, and philosophy, challenging Aristotle and Galen with empirical methods. Al-Biruni, the polymath who wrote on history, astronomy, mathematics, anthropology, and comparative religion, treating Hinduism with respect and curiosity at a time when such openness was rare. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, whose canon of medicine would be the standard textbook in European universities for 6 centuries, whose philosophical works influenced Thomas Aquinas and medieval Christian thought. Al-Ghazali, who reconciled Sufi mysticism with orthodox Sunni theology, transforming Islamic spirituality. Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us algorithm, who pioneered algebra and introduced Indian numerals to the Islamic world and thence to Europe. The House of Wisdom, founded in Baghdad in the 8th century by the Abbasid caliphs, became the greatest center of learning in the medieval world. And it was Persians, Persian scholars, Persian administrators, Persian translators, who made it flourish. They rendered Greek manuscripts into Arabic, preserving the philosophy of Aristotle and Plato, when Europe had forgotten them. They translated Sanskrit texts on mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. They synthesized, innovated, created new knowledge that advanced human understanding. This was the Islamic Golden Age, and it was, in many ways, a Persian Golden Age as well. The Abbasid caliphs, though Arab in origin, ruled from Persian-inspired courts with Persian-style bureaucracy, Persian poets singing their praises. The vizier, the chief minister, was almost invariably Persian. The language of administration became increasingly Persian rather than Arabic. The culture of the elite was Persian, the poetry they recited, the music they listened to, the food they ate, the gardens they built. But we must not romanticize this period, for alongside the brilliance of the courts and the libraries, there was exploitation. The translation movement required wealth, and wealth required taxation. The peasants of Iran, tilling the same fields their ancestors had tilled for millennia, saw little benefit from the philosophical speculations of Ibn Sina or the astronomical observations of al-Biruni. They paid their taxes, often in kind, grain, livestock, labor. They endured. They kept the ancient agricultural systems functioning, the qanats, the underground channels that brought water from the mountains to the plains, systems so efficient that they are still in use today, 3,000 years after their invention. And through it all, the trade continued. The Silk Road, that network of routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, passed through Iran. Caravanserais, fortified inns dotted the routes, providing shelter for merchants and their animals. The Persian Gulf, with the Strait of Hormuz as its gate, connected the Indian Ocean to the markets of the Middle East. Goods flowed, silk from China, spices from India and Southeast Asia, precious stones from Central Asia, ceramics from Iraq, textiles from Egypt, gold from Africa. Ideas flowed, mathematical concepts, medical techniques, artistic styles, religious movements. People flowed, merchants, pilgrims, slaves, scholars, adventurers, refugees. The city of Saraf on the Persian coast became one of the greatest ports of the medieval world. Arab and Persian navigators, building on Indian and Chinese knowledge, developed the lateen sail, allowing ships to tack against the wind. They mastered the monsoon patterns, sailing to India and back in a single year. They established trading colonies in East Africa, in India, in Southeast Asia. The city of Saraf on the Persian coast became one of the greatest ports of the medieval world. Arab and Persian navigators, building on Indian and Chinese knowledge, developed the lateen sail, allowing ships to tack against the wind. They mastered the monsoon patterns, sailing to India and back in a single year. They established trading colonies in East Africa, in India, in Southeast Asia. The Strait of Hormuz, controlled by the kingdom of that name, became a crucial node in this global economy, medieval globalization that linked the Mediterranean to the South China Sea, that made possible the exchange of goods and ideas across thousands of miles. But power shifted. In the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks, Central Asian nomads who had converted to Sunni Islam, swept across Iran. They were orthodox and warrior-like, champions of Sunni Islam against the Shia Fatimids of Egypt and the heresies that threatened Islamic unity. They took Baghdad in 1055, reducing the Abbasid caliphs to puppets. They established a new empire, Persian in administration, but Turkish in military character, that would rule Iran for over a century. And then in the 13th century came the catastrophe. The Mongols, Genghis Khan's armies, expanding westward from Mongolia with the momentum of a natural disaster, reached Iran in 1219. They destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire that had emerged in Central Asia. They sacked cities Merv, Nishapur, Ray, Isfahan, slaughtering populations, demolishing irrigation systems, destroying libraries and mosques and palaces, reducing centuries of civilization to rubble and ash. The qanats were filled in. The fields were abandoned. The population of Iran, estimated at perhaps 2 million before the invasion, fell by half or more. Some historians estimate that 75% of the population died through massacre, famine, disease, or flight. It was, by any measure, one of the greatest disasters in Iranian history, comparable to the Black Death in Europe or the conquest of the Americas. The Islamic Golden Age, already strained by political fragmentation and sectarian conflict, came to an effective end. The center of Islamic gravity shifted to Egypt under the Mamluks, to Syria, to Anatolia. Iran became a backwater, a devastated land struggling to recover from apocalypse. Its cities in ruins, its agriculture destroyed, its people scattered and demoralized. Yet Iran endured. The Mongols, for all their destructiveness, were not ideologues. They did not seek to impose a new religion or destroy an old one. They were interested in tribute, in submission, not in conversion. Within a generation, they had converted to Islam themselves. The Ilkhanid dynasty, established by Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu, ruled Iran for a century, patronizing art and architecture even as they taxed the population mercilessly, rebuilding some of what they had destroyed even as they remained alien rulers. And in the 14th century, a new conqueror emerged from the steppes Timur, or Tamerlane, who claimed descent from Genghis Khan and sought to restore the Mongol Empire. He built a new empire centered on his capital at Samarkand, conquering Iran in the 1380s. Like the Mongols, he was destructive. His campaigns were accompanied by massacre and devastation. Like the Mongols, he was also a patron of culture. His descendants, the Timurids, would rule Iran into the early 16th century, creating some of the most beautiful Islamic art and architecture the world has ever seen. The miniature paintings of the Timurid court, vivid, detailed, Persian in spirit despite the Turkish origins of the rulers, show us a world of gardens and palaces, of lovers meeting in moonlight, of heroes battling demons, of scholars debating in madrasas. They show us, too, the continuing importance of trade. The princes in these paintings wear Chinese silk. They sit on carpets woven in the Caucasus. They drink from ceramics imported from Iraq. They are surrounded by objects from across the known world. The Strait of Hormuz, though rarely depicted directly, was the invisible artery that made this luxury possible, the channel through which the wealth of the East reached the Iranian plateau. But the Timurid state, like all the post-Mongol states of Iran, was fragile. Timur's empire fragmented on his death. Local rulers, Turkmen chieftains from the tribes of the Karakuinlu and Aq, Kuinlu the Black Sheep and the White Sheep established petty kingdoms that fought each other for control of the plateau. The old institutions of centralized government had been destroyed by the Mongols and never fully rebuilt. Iran was, once again, a land of competing powers, vulnerable to the next wave of conquerors, the next imperial project that would seek to unify the plateau under a single authority. Those conquerors came in 1501, and this time they were not foreigners, they were Iranians. And they brought with them a new religious vision that would reshape the identity of the land, define its relationship with its neighbors for centuries to come, and set the stage for the conflicts that continue to this day, including the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz that has brought us to this documentary, that has closed the world's oil artery, that threatens the global economy. In 1501, a 15-year-old boy emerged from the mountains of northern Iran at the head of a mystical warrior brotherhood called the Kizilbash, the Redheads, for their distinctive red headgear. His followers called him the shadow of God on earth. They believed he was the Mahdi, the promised one, the messianic figure who would usher in the end of days and the triumph of justice over tyranny. They fought with religious frenzy, with the conviction that they were participating in a cosmic drama of redemption. They were Sufis, mystical Muslims, who had blended Shia devotion with shamanistic practices from their Central Asian homeland. Within 2 years, Ismail had conquered Tabriz, the great city of northwestern Iran, and crowned himself Shava king, using the ancient Persian title that reached back to the Achaemenids. Within 10 years, he had unified Iran. destroyed the remnants of the Timurids and the Turkmen confederations, and established an empire that stretched from Baghdad to Herat, from the Persian Gulf to the Oxus River. But Ismail was not merely a warrior, he was a revolutionary, and his revolution was religious. Ismail imposed a new faith on Iran, Twelver Shi'ism. This was not the Shi'ism of scholarly debate and theological nuance that had existed for centuries in various parts of the Islamic world. This was Shi'ism as political ideology, as national identity, as revolutionary fervor, as the defining characteristic of a new state. Ismail claimed descent from the Imams, the 12 descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, through his cousin and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib, whom Shias believe were the rightful leaders of the Islamic community. He proclaimed that these Imams had been denied their rightful authority by the Sunni caliphs, who seized power after the Prophet's death. He declared that his rule would restore justice, that his empire would be guided by the principles of Shia Islam, that Iran would be a beacon of true religion in a world of corruption and usurpation. To understand what this meant, we must understand the Sunni-Shia divide that had shaped Islamic history for centuries. It began in 632 CE with the death of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina. The majority of Muslims, the Sunnis, from Sunnah, meaning the custom or practice of the Prophet, believed that the community should choose its leader based on merit and consensus. They selected Abu Bakr, one of the Prophet's closest companions and fathers-in-law. A minority, the Shi'at Ali, the partisans of Ali, the leadership should remain within the Prophet's family. That divine authority passed through blood descent. They supported Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, the husband of his daughter Fatima. Ali eventually became the fourth caliph, but his authority was contested. He was assassinated in 661 CE by a Kharijite rebel. His sons, Hassan and Husayn, were denied their claim to leadership by the Umayyad dynasty that seized power. Hassan abdicated under pressure, but Husayn refused to submit. In 680 CE, he rose in revolt against the Umayyad Caliph Yazid, traveling to Kufa in Iraq to rally support. At Karbala, on the banks of the Euphrates, Hussein and a small band of followers, 72 warriors, along with women and children, were surrounded by Umayyad forces, denied water for 3 days under the burning sun, and then massacred. The men were killed. The women were taken captive. The head of Hussein was sent to Damascus as a trophy for the caliph. For Shia Muslims, Karbala is not merely history. It is living tragedy. It is the defining moment of their faith, the moment when justice was denied, when the innocent were slaughtered, when the forces of tyranny triumphed over the forces of righteousness, when the grandson of the Prophet was martyred for refusing to accept illegitimate rule. Every year, on the 10th day of the month of Muharram Ashura Shia, communities around the world reenact this tragedy. They weep, they beat their chests, they flagellate themselves with chains. They remember Husani's sacrifice, his courage, his refusal to compromise with evil. And they draw from this memory a theology of resistance, of opposition to unjust authority, of willingness to die for principle. Ismail made this faith the state religion of Iran. He imported Shia scholars from Lebanon, from Bahrain, from Iraqi Asians with long Shia traditions. He established religious colleges, madrasas, to train a new clerical elite. He endowed shrines, particularly the shrine of Imam Reza in Mashhad, the 8th Imam, who had died in Iran in the 9th century, and whose tomb had become a major pilgrimage site. He transformed Iran from a predominantly Sunni land into the bastion of Shi'ism it remains today, the only country in the world with a Shia majority, the center of Shia scholarship and authority. Why did he do this? Partly, it was genuine belief. Ismail had been raised in the mystical traditions of Sufism, and the Qizilbash Brotherhood blended Shia devotion with Sufi practices in ways that made the distinction between them almost meaningless. Partly it was political strategy. By adopting a distinct religious identity, Shiism and a Sunni majority. Islamic world Ismail differentiated his realm from the Sunni Ottoman Empire to the west and the Sunni Uzbek Khanates to the east. Shiism became a marker of Iranian identity, a badge of independence from the Arab and Turkish worlds that surrounded it, justification for the new dynasty's authority. The Safavid dynasty that Ismail founded would rule Iran for over 2 centuries, from 1501 to 1736, under Shah Abbas I, who came to the throne in 1588 at the age of 16 and ruled for 42 years. It reached its apogee. Abbas moved the capital to Isfahan, transforming it from a provincial town into one of the most beautiful cities in the world. The Naqshi Jahan Square is still one of the largest city squares in the world. Second only to Tiananmen in Beijing, was laid out, surrounded by mosques, palaces, and the entrance to the Great Bazaar. The Shah Mosque, with its perfect proportions, its intricate blue tile work, its acoustics that allow a speaker in the center of the dome to be heard throughout the vast space, was constructed over 20 years. The Chel Sotun Palace, with its 20 columns reflected in a long pool to create the illusion of 40 chial in Persian, became the center of court life, its walls covered with frescoes depicting Safavid victories and diplomatic receptions. Abbas was a patron of the arts, but he was also a ruthless politician. He blinded or killed his sons to prevent the succession disputes that had weakened previous dynasties. He reorganized the army, reducing the power of the Kizilbash tribes that had brought his grandfather to power, and creating a new force of slave soldiers, Georgians, Armenians, Circassians, captured in raids on the Caucasus, who owed loyalty only to him. He fought wars against the Ottomans, recovering territory lost to them. He campaigned against the Uzbeks in the east, and he turned his attention to the sea, understanding that control of trade required control of maritime routes. The Portuguese. Here we return to the Strait of Hormuz, to the maritime dimension of Iranian history that is so crucial to our story. In 1507, just 6 years after Ismail's coronation, a Portuguese fleet under Afonso de Albuquerque appeared in the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese were the pioneers of European expansion, seeking to break the Muslim monopoly on the spice trade that had enriched the Middle East for centuries. They were armed with a new technology-heavy naval cannon that allowed them to dominate sea battles against the lighter craft of the Indian Ocean powers. They had already established bases on the coast of East Africa and India. In 1507, Albuquerque bombarded Hormuz, the island kingdom that controlled the strait. In 1515, he returned with a larger force and conquered it. The Kingdom of Hormuz, which had maintained its independence for 4 centuries by playing larger powers against each other, became a Portuguese vassal. The Portuguese built a massive fortress on the island, the Fort of Our Lady of the Conception, with walls 20 feet thick and cannons that commanded the narrow channel. They controlled the strait. They taxed the trade that passed through it. They established a monopoly on the import of horses into Persia, a crucial trade, for the Safavid cavalry needed horses, and these had to come from Arabia or beyond, through Hormuz. For nearly a century, the Portuguese remained at Hormuz. They were not beloved. They interfered with local trade, favoring their own merchants. They attempted to convert Muslims to Christianity, sometimes by force, sometimes through inducements. They built churches and destroyed mosques. They represented a new kind of threat, not the land-based conquerors that Iran had faced for millennia, but seaborne empire, maritime power, European expansion that used technology to overcome distance and project force across the globe. In 1622, Shah Abbas expelled them. He allied with the British East India Company, another new power on the world stage, a commercial enterprise with its own army and navy, anticipating the multinational corporations of our own era. Together, Persian and British forces besieged Hormuz. The Portuguese, cut off from reinforcements, surrendered. The fortress was demolished. The strait returned to Iranian control. This was a significant moment. It demonstrated that the Safavids could project naval power, that they could coordinate with European allies, that they understood the strategic importance of sea power. It showed that European expansion could be resisted, that the new technologies of warfare could be mastered by non-European powers. And it confirmed the strategic importance of the Strait of Hormuz, not merely as a trade route, but as a symbol of sovereignty, a measure of national power, a choke point whose control determined the wealth and security of empire. But the Safavid achievement, like the Achaemenid achievement before it, could not last. The dynasty that Abbasi had forged through blood and brilliance declined after his death in 1629. His successors were less capable, less ruthless, less interested in governance than in pleasure. The harem became a center of intrigue, with eunuchs and concubines wielding influence over weak shahs. The Kizilbash tribes, suppressed by Abbas, regained influence and began fighting among themselves. The army, dependent on the slave soldiers who could not reproduce themselves, weakened. The treasury, depleted by constant warfare and court extravagance, ran dry. And in the east, a new threat emerged. The Afghans, Sunni Muslims chafing under Shia rule, rose in revolt. In 1722, a charismatic Afghan leader named Mirwais Hotak, and after his death his son Mahmud, led an army that captured Isfahan itself. The last Safavid Shah, Sultan Husain, was forced to abdicate. The empire collapsed, not with a bang but with a whimper, its capital occupied, its territories fragmented, its legitimacy shattered. What followed was chaos. Nadir Shah, a Turkmen military commander of genius who emerged from the wreckage, expelled the Afghans and conquered territory from Delhi to Baghdad, creating a short-lived empire that rivaled the Safavid achievement in territorial extent. But Nadir was a conqueror, not a state builder. His rule was based on plunder and terror. On his assassination in 1747, his empire immediately fragmented. For half a century, Iran was divided among warlords, tribal chiefs, and petty kings. A land without central authority, vulnerable to invasion and anarchy. Order was restored in 1794 by Aga Mohammed Khan Qajar, a eunuch who had been castrated in childhood by the Afghans, an injury that fueled a legendary cruelty. He reunited Iran through sheer brutality, moving the capital to Tehran, a small town that had previously been notable only for its pleasant climate and abundant water, and establishing the Qajar dynasty that would rule until 1925. But the Qajars faced a world transformed beyond recognition. The Industrial Revolution was beginning in Europe, creating new technologies, new forms of organization, new military capabilities. Steam power was replacing sail. European empires, British, French, Russian, were expanding into Asia with a momentum that seemed unstoppable. And the balance of power that had allowed Iran to maintain its independence, playing one rival against another, was shifting decisively in Europe's favor. The Qajar Shahs, for all their pretensions to absolute monarchy, found themselves increasingly at the mercy of European powers. They borrowed money from British and Russian banks at usurious rates. They granted concessions to European companies, trading monopolies, mining rights, railway charters that mortgaged the country's future. They lost territory of Herat in Afghanistan to the British, the Caucasus provinces of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan to the Russians. They became, in essence, clients of the great powers, unable to pursue an independent foreign policy, their sovereignty hollowed out by debt and dependency. And then, in the late 19th century, something happened that would transform not just Iran, but the entire region around the Strait of Hormuz. Something that would eventually lead to the crisis we face today, to the blockade that has closed the world's oil artery, to the confrontation that threatens the global economy. They discovered oil. It began, as so many transformative discoveries do, with an accident. In 1908, a British businessman named William Knox Darcy, who had secured a concession from the Qajar Shah in 1901 to search for minerals, was about to give up. His expedition had drilled for 3 years in the Zagros Mountains, finding nothing but dust and debt and disappointment. The geologists were skeptical. The investors in London were impatient, threatening to cut off funding. Darcy, who had made his fortune in Australian gold mining, was preparing to abandon the project, to write off his losses, to accept that there was no oil in Persia. And then, at Masjid Saliman in the province of Khuzestan near the Persian Gulf, the drill hit a pocket of oil at a depth of 1,180 feet. It gushed forth black, viscous, valuable beyond calculation. The oil sprayed 50 feet into the air. The British engineers, covered in crude, danced with joy. The local workers, who had labored for years with little pay and less hope, watched in awe as the earth yielded up its treasure. The British government, recognizing immediately the strategic importance of this discovery, became involved within months. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed later to become the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, later still British Petroleum, one of the world's largest corporations. And Iran's fate, and the fate of the Strait of Hormuz, was sealed. Oil changed everything. It transformed the global economy, creating new industries, automobiles, aviation, petrochemicals, plastics, that would define the 20th century. It transformed geopolitics, making the Middle East previously a backwater of the Ottoman Empire, important mainly as a route to India, into the cockpit of great power rivalry, the most strategically vital region on earth. And it transformed Iran, binding the country's economy to the whims of international markets and the strategies of imperial powers, creating wealth that benefited few and dependency that harmed many.
The British built a refinery at Abadan, on the Shat al-Arab waterway, near where the Tigris and Euphrates meet the Persian Gulf. It became the largest refinery in the world, a sprawling industrial complex that processed millions of barrels of crude into the fuel that powered the Royal Navy and the British Empire. They built pipelines across the Iranian plateau, carrying oil from the wells to the coast. They built port facilities, tank farms, loading terminals. They employed thousands of Iranian workers, but at wages far below those of their British counterparts, in conditions that were often dangerous and always discriminatory. The British lived in compounds segregated from the local population garden suburbs with tennis courts and swimming pools, clubs where alcohol was served and Iranians were excluded. A world apart from the Iran they exploited. They controlled every aspect of the oil industry, from exploration to marketing. While the Iranian government received only a small royalties, 16% of profits, later renegotiated to 20%, but calculated in ways that minimized Iran's share. It was extraction, colonialism, different in form from the direct rule of India or Africa, where the British governed territory, but similar in essence, the wealth of the land flowing to the imperial center. The local population left with poverty and resentment, and in the countryside, tribal leaders and religious authorities watched with alarm as the central government, dependent on oil revenues and increasingly influenced by foreign advisors, grew detached from traditional Iranian society and values. The constitutional revolution of 1906 was, in part, a response to this situation, inspired by the Russian Revolution of 1905 and the Young Turk movement in the Ottoman Empire. Iranian merchants, clerics, intellectuals, and ordinary people demanded a constitution, a parliament, the majlis, limits on the power of the monarchy. They wanted to modernize Iran, yes, to build railways, establish schools, create a modern legal system but on Iranian terms, not as a client of British imperialism. They wanted the oil wealth to benefit Iranians, not foreign shareholders. The revolution succeeded, after a fashion. A constitution was granted, modeled on the Belgian constitution. A parliament was established, with elected representatives, though the franchise was limited to male property owners. A new Shah, the weak and vacillating Muhammad Ali, was installed after his father was forced to abdicate, but the Kayar Shahs remained, and they were weak and venal. The British and Russians continued to interfere, dividing Iran into spheres of influence in the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 Russia in the north, Britain in the south, a neutral zone in between, and the oil continued to flow out of the country into British tanks, into the British treasury, into the engines of the Royal Navy that maintained Britain's global dominance. World War I devastated Iran. Though officially neutral, the country was occupied by British, Russian, and Ottoman forces who used it as a battlefield and a supply route. Famine killed millions, perhaps a quarter of the population. Disease ran rampant. The fragile constitutional order collapsed under the pressure of war and occupation, and when the war ended, Iran found itself facing a new threat from the north. Soviet Russia, revolutionary and expansionist, seeking to spread communism and regain the territories lost in the Russo-Persian Wars. In this crisis, a new figure emerged, Reza Khan, a Cossack officer of humble origins. His father had been a farmer who died when Reza was young, leaving him to be raised by relatives seized power in a coup in 1921. He was not an ideologue, not a revolutionary in the communist sense. He was a nationalist, a man who believed that Iran needed strong central government to survive in a predatory world of imperial powers. In 1925, he deposed the last Qajar Shah and crowned himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, king of the Pahlavi dynasty, taking a name from the ancient Persian language that connected him to the pre-Islamic past. Reza Shah was, in many ways, the Iranian Ataturk, the Turkish leader who was simultaneously transforming his own country. He modernized the army, creating a conscript force equipped with modern weapons. He built roads and railways. The Trans-Iranian Railway, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea, was one of the great engineering feats of the interwar period. Built entirely with Iranian money to avoid foreign control, he established a secular legal system, reducing the power of the clerics who had dominated justice under the Qajars. He banned the veil for women and required men to wear Western-style hats instead of traditional turbans or caps. He sent students to Europe to learn modern sciences, engineering, medicine. He created a modern bureaucracy, a modern educational system, a modern nation-state where one had not existed before. But he was also a dictator. He crushed opposition, imprisoned dissidents, censored the press, controlled elections. His modernization was imposed by force on a population that was often conservative and religious, that resented the abandonment of traditional ways. He remained dependent on the oil revenues that flowed, still, primarily to the British-controlled company, and his authoritarian methods created resentment that would fester and eventually explode. In 1935, Reza Shah made a symbolic change that revealed his ideological agenda. He asked foreign governments to stop using the name Persia and instead use Iran, the name the people had always called their country. Persia was associated with the ancient empire, with luxury, with weakness, with the Qajar decadence. Iran meant land of the Aryans, a term that connected the country to the Indo-European peoples, and, in the racial theories of the 1930s, to modernity and strength. It was a claim of racial and civilizational superiority, of connection to the ancient past, of a new identity for a new era. But Reza Shah's alignment with Nazi Germany, motivated partly by anti-British sentiment, partly by the racial theories that flattered Iranian nationalism, partly by the simple desire to balance British influence with German, proved his undoing. In 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union, allied against Hitler, invaded Iran. They needed the railway to supply the Soviet Union with Lend-Lease aid. They needed to secure the oil fields. They needed to remove a potential German ally from their rear. Reza Shah abdicated in favor of his young son, Mohammad Reza, and died in exile in South Africa 3 years later, a broken man. The war years were humiliating for Iran. Though officially neutral, the country was occupied by foreign troops who controlled its communications, its transport, its economy. The Allies used Iran as a corridor to supply the Soviet Union, the Persian corridor, that moved thousands of tons of supplies across the plateau. They controlled the oil. They dictated policy. They removed officials they disliked, and when the war ended, the Soviet Union refused to withdraw from the northern provinces of Azerbaijan and Kurdistan, supporting separatist governments, therein a blatant violation of Iranian sovereignty. It was the United States, now emerging as a global superpower with ambitions that reached far beyond its Western Hemisphere origins, that pressured the Soviets to withdraw. The Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947, promised American support for countries resisting communist expansion. Iran became a client of the United States, just as it had once been a client of Britain. The Americans replaced the British as the dominant foreign influence, bringing with them their own advisors, their own military missions, their own economic interests. Mohammad Reza Shah, young and insecure, uncertain of his throne, grew into his role with American support. With CIA assistance, he crushed the Communist Tudeh Party and the nationalist movement in Azerbaijan. He established the Savak, a secret police force, trained by the CIA and Mossad, that would become notorious for its torture and repression. He controlled the Majlis through bribery and manipulation, ensuring that elections always produced the results he wanted. And he lived in extravagant luxury, building palaces, collecting art and automobiles, traveling the world, while his people struggled with poverty and inequality and political repression. But the central issue remained oil. By the early 1950s, Iranian nationalists had had enough. The oil industry was the country's greatest asset, the source of wealth that should have made Iran prosperous, and yet it was controlled by foreigners. The British government received more in taxes from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company than the Iranian government received in royalties. The company employed few Iranians in senior positions. The refinery at Abadan was a state within a state, with its own schools, its own hospitals, its own segregated facilities. It was, many Iranians felt, a continuation of the colonial exploitation that had begun with Darcy's concession in 1901, a symbol of national humiliation. Into this situation stepped Mohammad Mossadegh, a charismatic aristocrat with a law degree from Switzerland and a reputation for incorruptibility. Mossadegh became prime minister in 1951 on a platform of nationalizing the oil industry. He was not a revolutionary in the communist sense. He was a constitutionalist, a democrat, a man who believed in the rule of law and parliamentary government. He believed that Iran's wealth should belong to Iranians, that the oil industry should be owned and operated by the state for the benefit of the nation. He nationalized the oil. He expelled the British technicians. He appealed to the United Nations and the International Court of Justice, seeking international support for Iran's position. The British were furious. They organized a boycott of Iranian oil, preventing tankers from loading at Abadan. They blockaded the Persian Gulf, using their naval power to intimidate potential buyers. They froze Iranian assets in London. They plotted to overthrow using their intelligence networks and their connections with Iranian politicians and military officers. And when their initial schemes failed, when Mossadegh proved more popular and more resilient than they had anticipated, they turned to the Americans for help. The CIA, under the direction of Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, a man who relished the role of covert operator, organized Operation Ajax. It was a textbook case of Cold War covert action, propaganda to turn public opinion against Mossadegh, bribes to politicians and military officers and religious leaders, mobilization of street gangs and criminal elements, pressure on the Shah to sign decrees dismissing Mossadegh. And in August 1953, after an initial failure and a second attempt, it succeeded. Mossadegh was arrested, tried for treason, and imprisoned. The Shah, who had fled to Rome in panic, returned to Tehran in triumph, and the oil industry was denationalized, though now American companies shared in the concession, breaking the British monopoly and giving the United States the dominant position. For the Shah, the coup was a victory that secured his throne. For the United States, it was a Cold War success that prevented a potentially communist-linked government from consolidating power. For Britain, it was a restoration of imperial interests, albeit diminished. But for Iran, it was a tragedy that would shape the country's destiny for generations. Mossadegh had been the most popular leader in the country's modern history, a man who had stood up to the great powers and asserted Iranian dignity, who had embodied the constitutional aspirations of 1906, who had offered a vision of democratic nationalism. His overthrow taught a generation of Iranians that the United States was not a friend of democracy, but an imperial power like Britain and Russia before it. It taught them that their government was a puppet, maintained by foreign bayonets. It taught them that the oil that flowed beneath their land would always be controlled by others. The Shah, secure in his power thanks to American support, launched the White Revolution in 1963, a program of modernization that included land reform, literacy campaigns, industrial development, and votes for women. On the surface, Iran was prospering. Oil revenues flooded in as production increased and prices rose. The military expanded, equipped with the latest American weapons. Skyscrapers rose in Tehran. The Shah hosted the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire at Persepolis in 1971, spending millions on a celebration that included the Emperor of Ethiopia, the Prince of Wales, the Vice President of the United States, and dozens of other world leaders, a spectacle of royal power that recalled the ancient Achaemenids. But beneath the glitter, the society was rotting. The land reform had disrupted traditional village life without creating viable, modern agriculture. Peasants received land too small to support them, lacked capital and expertise, and eventually sold out to larger landowners. The oil wealth enriched a tiny elite royal family, courtiers, military officers, wealthy businessmen with connections to the regime, while leaving the masses in poverty. The Savak tortured and killed thousands, creating a climate of fear that prevented open dissent, but could not prevent private resentment. The Shah's court was notoriously corrupt, with the royal family and their cronies accumulating vast fortunes through monopolies and kickbacks. And the religious establishment, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, was gathering strength in opposition. Khomeini had been arrested and exiled for his opposition to the White Revolution, particularly its land reform, which threatened religious endowments, and its granting of votes to women, which he saw as un-Islamic. From Najaf in Iraq, the great center of Shia learning, he developed a revolutionary ideology that blended Shia Islam with anti-imperialism. He argued that monarchy was inherently un-Islamic, that legitimate rule belonged to religious scholars who understood Islamic law, that the Shah was a tyrant and an American puppet who should be overthrown, and he denounced the United States as the Great Satan, the source of all corruption and oppression in the Muslim world. By the mid-1970s, the opposition had coalesced into a formidable force. Leftists, nationalists, Islamists, bazaar merchants, workers, students all agreed that the Shah must go. Though they disagreed on what should replace him, strikes paralyzed the economy. Demonstrations filled the streets, despite the risk of savage torture and death. The Shah, diagnosed with cancer and increasingly isolated, dithered between repression and concession. The Americans, focused on Cold War competition with the Soviet Union, failed to recognize the depth of the crisis until it was too late. In January 1979, the Shah fled never to return, dying in Egypt the following year. The monarchy that had ruled Iran for over 2 millennia, since the time of Cyrus and Darius, was at an end, and into the vacuum stepped a figure who had been waiting in exile. Preparing for this moment, organizing the forces that would shape the new order, they came by the millions. They lined the streets from Mehrabad Airport to the center of Tehran, a human river 20 miles long. They had waited 15 years through exile, through prison, through the secret police and the censorship and the fear that had gripped the land. And now he was back. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, 76 years old, dressed in the black robes and turban of a Sayyida, descendant of the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter Fatima. His face was stern, ascetic, unreadable to Western eyes. He did not smile. He did not wave. He looked upon the crowd with the gravity of a man who knew that history had placed a burden upon his shoulders, that he was the instrument of divine will, that he was returning to complete the revolution that had begun with the Prophet 14 centuries before. Islam is the religion of militant individuals, he had written from exile in Najaf. Islam is the religion of those who desire freedom and independence. Islam is the religion of those who struggle against colonialism and oppression. Islam is the religion of the oppressed against the oppressors. Now, standing before the Iranian people, he made his intentions clear. There would be no accommodation with the old regime. There would be no sharing of power with the liberals and nationalists and leftists who had also opposed the Shah. There would be an Islamic republic, governed by Islamic law, led by Islamic scholars who understood the true meaning of the faith. There would be a complete break with the past, with the westernizing, secularizing, corrupting influences that had dominated Iran for half a century. The revolution moved with breathtaking speed. Within weeks, the imperial government collapsed. The military, which the Americans had counted on to preserve order and suppress the revolution, declared its neutrality. The bureaucracy, the police, the media all fell to revolutionary committees organized by Khomeini's followers. Show trials were held in improvised courts. Generals, ministers, Savak officials, wealthy businessmen were executed by firing squad. The Pahlavi state was dismantled brick by brick, its symbols destroyed, its history rewritten, its personnel killed or imprisoned or forced into exile. But the revolution was not only about politics, it was a social transformation, a cultural revolution, a reordering of Iranian society from top to bottom that sought to create a new kind of human being, an Islamic citizen purified of Western corruption. Women were required to wear the veil hijab in public. Those who refused were harassed, arrested, sometimes attacked by revolutionary vigilantes. Alcohol was banned, the nightclubs and casinos of the Shah's era closed, and it was violent. The revolution devoured its children. The leftists, the Fedayeen and Mojahedin Khalq, who had fought alongside the Islamists against the Shah, were crushed. The Tudeh Communist Party, which had supported the revolution, was suppressed and its leaders executed. The Kurds, demanding autonomy for their region, were attacked by the Revolutionary Guard. The Turkmen, the Baluch, the Arabs all faced the centralizing power of the new state. Thousands were executed in the first years of the revolution. Tens of thousands fled into exile, creating a diaspora that would reshape Iranian communities from Los Angeles to London to Dubai. Then, in November 1979, came the hostage crisis, the event that would define Iran's relationship with the United States for a generation. A group of radical students, inspired by Khomeini's anti-imperialist rhetoric, but perhaps not acting on his direct orders, stormed the American embassy in Tehran on November 4, 1979. They took 66 Americans, hostage diplomats, Marines, embassy staff. They demanded that the United States return the Shah, who was receiving medical treatment in New York, to face trial in Iran for his crimes. They demanded that the United States apologize for its interference in Iranian affairs, particularly the 1953 coup against Mossadegh. They demanded the return of the Shah's wealth, which they claimed he had stolen from the Iranian people. The Carter administration, caught off guard and humiliated, attempted diplomacy. They froze Iranian assets. They imposed sanctions. they sought help from allies. Then, in April 1980, they attempted a military rescue operation Eagle Claw. It failed disastrously. Helicopters malfunctioned in the desert sandstorm. Aircraft collided at the refueling site in the Iranian desert called Desert 1. 8 American servicemen died. The hostages remained in captivity, and President Carter's inability to resolve the crisis contributed to his defeat in the 1980 election by Ronald Reagan. For 444 days, the crisis dragged on. Night after night, American television networks counted the days of captivity, the America Held Hostage program, that eventually became Nightline. The humiliation of the United States was total. A superpower, unable to protect its diplomats, unable to rescue its citizens, held at bay by a group of revolutionary students in a country that most Americans could not locate on a map. For Iran, it was a demonstration that the revolution could defy the world's greatest power, that the great Satan could be resisted, that a new kind of politics was possible. The hostages were released on January 20th, 1981, the day Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president, the moment of American national renewal. But by then, Iran was at war. Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, had watched the Iranian Revolution with alarm and opportunism. He feared that Iran's revolutionary Shiism would inspire his own country's Shia majority to rise against his Sunni-dominated, secular but increasingly Islamist-tinged regime. He saw opportunity in Iran's chaos, the military decimated by purges of top officers, the economy in shambles, the government inexperienced and ideological, the Kurdish and other minority movements in revolt. He claimed the Strait of Hormuz waterway, the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates that formed Iraq's only outlet to the sea, which had been divided between the two countries by a 1975 treaty that Saddam now repudiated. In September 1980, Iraq invaded. Saddam expected a quick victorious strike to seize the oil-rich province of Khuzestan Arabistan to the Iraqis, to force a favorable settlement of border disputes, to topple the nascent Islamic Republic before it could consolidate its power. He was wrong. The Iranians, despite their revolutionary turmoil, rallied to defend their country. The war became a bloodbath, trench war reminiscent of World War I, with human wave attacks by Iranian teenagers armed only with keys to paradise around their necks, symbolizing their belief that martyrdom would open the gates of heaven, with chemical weapons used by Iraq against Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians, with missile attacks on cities. The war of the cities that killed thousands of civilians on both sides. It lasted 8 years. It claimed over 1 million lives. It devastated both economies. It left scars that have never healed. And throughout the war, the Strait of Hormuz was a flashpoint. Iraq attacked Iranian oil tankers, seeking to cripple the Iranian economy. Iran retaliated, attacking tankers serving Arab states that supported Iraq. Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the United States, protecting its allies and its oil interests, became involved escorting tankers, reflagging Kuwaiti ships to protect them under American law, clashing with Iranian forces in a series of naval skirmishes. Operation Praying Mantis, April 1988. The largest American naval battle since World War II. American forces destroyed half of Iran's operational navy in a single day. 2 frigates, a gunboat, 3 speedboats. The USS Vincennes, in the confusion of combat, shot down an Iranian civilian airliner, Iran Air Flight 650, killing all 290 people on board. The United States claimed it was an accident, that the Vincennes mistook the airliner for an attacking fighter. Iran claimed it was deliberate, a warning to Tehran. Shortly after, Iran accepted a UN-brokered ceasefire. The war ended where it began. No borders changed, no victors, only losers. Nearly 1 million dead, billions of dollars in destruction, 2 economies ruined. But Iran emerged from the conflict with its revolutionary regime intact, hardened by war, convinced of its own resilience, possessed of a profound sense of victimhood, a belief that the world, led by the United States, had supported Saddam's aggression, had turned a blind eye to chemical weapons, had sought to destroy the Islamic Republic by proxy. Ayatollah Khomeini died in 1989, a year after the war's end. He was succeeded by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, a lesser figure who lacked Khomeini's charisma and scholarly credentials, but who has proven to be a shrewd political operator, surviving for over 3 decades in a position of supreme power. The constitution was amended to give the supreme leader Khamenei's powers over the military, the judiciary, the media, and the key state institutions, ensuring that the Islamic Republic would remain a theocracy even as it evolved. The 1990s were years of reconstruction and consolidation. The war was over. The revolutionary fervor had cooled into institutionalized ideology, a system of rule that combined elected institutions, the presidency, the parliament with unelected bodies controlled by the clerical establishment, the Guardian Council, the Expediency Council, the Supreme Leader's Office, A new generation had come of age, children of the revolution, who knew nothing of the Shah's Iran, who had grown up with war and scarcity and religious education, who was simultaneously more Iranian and more Islamic than their parents. And then, in 1997, came a surprise. Mohammad Khatami, a reformist cleric who had served as Minister of Culture and been dismissed by conservatives for his liberal views, was elected president in a landslide. Young people, women, intellectuals, those who had felt excluded from the revolutions, promises rallied to his call for a dialogue of civilizations, for political openness, for cultural freedom, for an end to Iran's isolation. For a brief moment, it seemed that Iran might evolve toward a more open society. The press flourished, with newspapers publishing articles that would have been unthinkable a few years before. Civil society organizations multiplied. Women pushed back against restrictive dress codes. Intellectuals debated the future of the revolution, but the reformists were blocked at every turn by the hardliners who controlled the judiciary, the security services, and the office of the supreme leader. Newspapers were closed, activists were arrested. Khatami's promises of change went unfulfilled. His supporters grew disillusioned. In 2005, the pendulum swung back hard. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a hardline mayor of Tehran with a background in the Revolutionary Guard and the besieged militia, was elected president. A man of humble origins, his father was a blacksmith. Ahmadinejad appealed to the rural poor, the devout, those who felt left behind by the reformists' cultural openness and cosmopolitanism. He was also a provocateur, a Holocaust denier, a man who seemed to delight in confrontation with the West, declaring that Israel should be wiped off the map and that the United States was a declining power. Most dangerously, Ahmadinejad accelerated Iran's nuclear program. Iran had begun developing nuclear technology during the Shah's era with American assistance for peaceful purposes. The program had been suspended during the revolution and the war, but had resumed in the 1990s with help from Pakistan and others. Under Ahmadinejad, it accelerated. Enrichment facilities were built at Natanz and Fordo. Centrifuges spun, separating uranium isotopes. Iran moved closer to the capability to produce weapons-grade uranium, though it insisted its program was for peaceful energy production only. The world watched with alarm. Israel, seeing an existential threat in the possibility of Iranian nuclear weapons, prepared military options and conducted covert operations against Iranian scientists. The United States, bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan, pursued sanctions and diplomacy while keeping military options on the table. The UN Security Council passed resolution after resolution demanding Iran halt enrichment. The Iranian economy, cut off from international markets, began to suffer. And through it all, the Strait of Hormuz remained Iran's trump card. The United States could impose sanctions. Israel could threaten airstrikes. The UN could pass resolutions. But if Iran chose to close the strait, if it mined the waters, attacked tankers, blockaded the narrow channel, the global economy would convulse. 20% of the world's oil would be cut off. Prices would spike to levels that would trigger recession. The United States would face the choice of accepting economic catastrophe or launching a massive military operation to reopen the strait, with all the risks of wider war that entailed. It was a deterrent, a threat, a bargaining chip, and it was rooted in history, in the understanding that geography had given Iran this power, that the strait was the jugular vein of the global economy, that control of this choke point meant leverage over the great powers that depended upon it. The ancient kings of Hormuz had understood this. The Portuguese and the Safavids had fought over it. The British had sought to control it. And now, in the 21st century, Iran was asserting its claim. In 2013, Hassan Rouhani was elected president, a moderate cleric who had negotiated with the West in the past, who promised to resolve the nuclear issue and end Iran's isolation. In 2015, after years of secret negotiations, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was signed, the Iran nuclear deal. Iran agreed to limit its nuclear activities, to reduce its centrifuges, to accept intrusive inspections, in exchange for sanctions relief. The strait remained open. Oil flowed, prices stabilized. It seemed, briefly, that a new chapter might begin, that Iran might be reintegrated into the global economy, that the cycle of hostility might be broken. But the deal was fragile. In 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the agreement, calling it the worst deal ever negotiated. Maximum pressure sanctions were imposed, designed to drive Iranian oil exports to zero, to collapse the Iranian economy, to force Iran to negotiate a new deal on American terms. The Iranian economy did collapse. The rial lost 80% of its value. Inflation soared to 50%. Unemployment spread. Poverty increased. The promise of the nuclear disintegration with the global economy, prosperity, normalization of and Iran responded. He began to violate the nuclear limits, step by step, gradually increasing its enrichment. It attacked tankers in the Gulf with mines and limpet charges. In September 2019, it launched a devastating drone and missile strike on Saudi oil facilities at Abqaiq, temporarily having Saudi production, demonstrating that it could disrupt oil supplies even without closing the strait. The region teetered on the brink of war. Then, in January 2020, the United States assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Quds Force, the expeditionary arm of the Revolutionary Guard, the architect of Iran's regional strategy in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq. A drone strike at Baghdad airport, a targeted killing of a state official, an act of war by any traditional definition. Iran retaliated with missile strikes on American bases in Iraq. Miraculously, no Americans were killed, whether because Iran warned of the strikes in advance, or because of luck, or because of missile defense systems. Both sides stepped back from the brink, but the hostility, the deep, structural, ideological hostility between the Islamic Republic and the United States remained, festered, grew. And now, in 2026, we have arrived at the crisis that opened this documentary. The blockade of the strait. The surge in oil prices to $126 per barrel and rising to 20,000 mariners stranded in the Gulf of Oman. The world held hostage by a narrow waterway and the power that controls it. How did we get here? We have traveled through 5,000 years of history to answer that question. We have seen empires rise and fall. We have seen religions born and transformed. We have seen the discovery of oil and the interventions of great powers. We have seen revolution and war, hope and despair, the enduring resilience of a civilization that has faced conquest after conquest and yet endured. And now, we must look at the Iran of today. The Iran that has made this extraordinary, dangerous, perhaps desperate move. Who are the Iranians who staffed those Revolutionary Guard boats? What do they believe? What do they want? What kind of society has emerged from this long history of glory and tragedy, of empire and revolution, of isolation and resistance? Come with me to Tehran, to a city of 15 million people, sprawling across the foothills of the Alborz Mountains, smog-choked, vibrant, exhausting, alive with the energy of a young population, struggling against the constraints of an authoritarian regime. It is morning. Young Iranians, men with carefully styled hair, women with colorful headscarves, pushed back to reveal as much hair as possible. Everyone with smartphones and hand-gathering cafes that would not look out of place in Brooklyn or Berlin or Bangkok. They drink espresso and cappuccino. They discuss politics, films, philosophy, the latest episode of a Turkish soap opera watched via VPN. They check Instagram and Telegram when the government's censorship has not blocked them, when the VPN is working, when the authorities are looking the other way. They want freedom, freedom to dress as they please, to love whom they choose, to speak their minds, to travel. They want to build careers, to start businesses, to create art, to make lives of meaning and pleasure. The statistics are staggering. 70% of Iran's population is under the age of 40. University enrollment is among the highest in the region, higher, in fact, than many Western countries. Iranian women outnumber men in higher education. A remarkable transformation from the days when female literacy was rare. The country produces more scientific papers than any other in the Middle East. It has a vibrant film industry, despite censorship that restricts what can be shown. It has world-class poets, painters, musicians, though many of them work in exile. They aren't banned at home, but celebrated abroad. But the economy is a shambles. Youth unemployment is estimated at 25%, though the real figure is likely higher when underemployment is counted. Inflation has destroyed savings, wiped out the middle class, made life a constant struggle to make ends meet. The currency has collapsed, the rial trades at a fraction of its official value on the black market. Young people with engineering degrees drive taxis. Graduates of elite universities emigrate by the hundreds of thousands, brain drain on a massive scale. The country's best and brightest leaving for Canada, Australia, Europe, America, Dubai, anywhere that offers opportunity. And yet, most stay. They adapt. They find ways to live within the constraints of the system, to push against its boundaries, to carve out spaces of freedom in the interstices of control. They hold multiple jobs. They rely on family networks, the extended family, the dour circles of friends, the relationships that provide support when the state fails. They participate in the informal economy, the vast gray market of smuggled goods, unlicensed services, cash transactions that evades government control, and taxation that keeps people alive when the formal economy cannot. The bazaar, the traditional marketplace, remains the heart of Iranian commerce. In Tehran's Grand Bazaar, a labyrinth of covered alleyways stretching for miles, merchants sell everything from spices to electronics to carpets to gold. The bazaar has its own hierarchy, its own codes, its own relationship with political power. The merchant class supported the 1979 revolution against the Shah's modernization. Now, chafing under sanctions and economic mismanagement, many are restive, caught between loyalty to the Islamic Republic and the reality of doing business in a collapsing economy. The carpets tell stories. The design's geometric patterns, floral motifs, garden scenes, medallions carry centuries of tradition. Each region has its style. The intricate florals of Isfahan, the bold medallions of Tabriz, the tribal patterns of the Kashkai and Bakhtiari, the fine silk rugs of Qom. Weaving is women's work, done in homes and workshops across the country. A fine carpet can take years to complete. It is art, but it is also investment, a store of value in an economy where currency is unstable, where banks cannot be trusted, where the future is uncertain. But sanctions have devastated the carpet industry. Americans, who were once the largest buyers of Persian rugs, can no longer legally import them. The market has been taken over by machine-made copies from India and China, or by rugs from other countries that can be sold as Persian style. Other traditional industries, pistachios, saffron, caviar, dried fruits, have similarly suffered. The agricultural sector, which should be a strength given Iran's varied climate and ancient irrigation systems, has been neglected in favor of oil, starved of investment, unable to compete with imports. And yet, there is resilience. There is ingenuity. Iranian engineers, cut off from international markets and technology, have developed domestic alternatives for many products. The pharmaceutical industry produces most of the country's medicines locally. Though shortages of raw materials caused by sanctions create crises, the defense industry reverse engineers foreign technology, producing missiles, drones, and other weapons. The nuclear program, despite sabotage, assassination of scientists, and cyber attacks, has advanced to the point where Iran is a threshold nuclear state, capable of producing weapons-grade material within months if it chose to do so. This is the paradox of contemporary Iran. A society under immense pressure, economically crippled, politically authoritarian, socially restrictive and, yet culturally vibrant, scientifically productive, historically aware, proud of its heritage and its achievements, a society that has survived the Mongols, the Timurids, the Afghan invasions, the KR humiliations, the Pahlavi dictatorship, the war with Iraq, the sanctions and, still endures, still creates, still dreams of a better future. The national soccer team, Team Melli, is a source of genuine national unity that transcends politics. When they play in the World Cup, the country stops. Young and old, secular and religious, pro-government and oppositional, cheer together. All suffer together, all celebrate together. The players are celebrities, their lives followed obsessively, their successes and failures shared by millions. And when they lose, the disappointment is collective, national, deeply felt in a way that only sport can produce. But sports, like everything else in Iran, is political. The ban on women attending soccer matches enforced for years on the grounds that it was inappropriate for women to see men in shorts, that the atmosphere was too masculine, that it violated Islamic morality, became a flashpoint for the women's movement. Women protested, disguising themselves as men to enter stadiums, risking arrest and worse. Some were detained, beaten, charged with crimes against public morality. The world watched the tragedy of Sahar Kodiari, known as the Blue Girl, for her support of the Estaglao team, who set herself on fire in 2019 after being arrested for trying to enter a match. She died of her burns. The pressure became unbearable. In 2022, after years of resistance, women were finally allowed to attend matches in limited numbers. Small victories, incremental changes. The Iran of today is not the Iran of 1979, whatever the government's ideology might claim. Women drive, they were banned from driving under the Shah, ironically, and gained that right under the Islamic Republic. They work as lawyers, doctors, engineers, artists, journalists, academics, though they face discrimination, though they cannot serve as judges, though they inherit half what men do under Islamic law. They vote though the candidates are vetted by the Guardian Council, though the elections are neither free nor fair, though their votes often seem to change little. They push boundaries, testing the limits of what is permitted, creating spaces of autonomy in a system designed for control. The girl, woman, life, freedom protests of 2022 to 2023 showed the depth of discontent and the courage of Iranian women. Triggered by the death of Mahsa Aminiya, young Kurdish woman arrested by the morality police for allegedly wearing her headscarf improperly, who died in custody, probably from beatings the protests spread across the country and the diaspora. Woman, life, freedom. The slogan combined feminist, ecological, and democratic aspirations. Young women removed their headscarves in public, danced in the streets, confronted security forces. Men joined them. The protests lasted for months, Despite a brutal crackdown, hundreds killed, thousands arrested, executions of protesters, and through all of this, the protests, the repression, the economic crisis, the international isolation, the Strait of Hormuz has remained. The trump card, the deterrent, the symbol of Iran's ability to strike at the global economy, even as it suffers, to assert its power, even when it seems weak, to remind the world that geography has given it leverage that cannot be ignored. The Revolutionary Guard Sepi Pastarin has grown in power since the revolution. Originally a militia to protect the new regime from coup attempts, it has become a state within a state. It controls vast economic interest construction, telecommunications, smuggling oil exports that evade sanctions. It has its own navy, its own air force, its own intelligence service, its own ballistic missile force, and it controls the Strait. The Guard's naval strategy is asymmetric. Iran cannot challenge the United States in a conventional naval battle. The American Navy is too strong, too technologically advanced, with aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines and precision weapons that could destroy the Iranian Navy in days. But Iran can make the price of conflict unbearable. It can mine the Strait using bottom-moored mines that are hard to detect and clear. It can use swarms of small, fast attack boats, fast inshore attack craft, to overwhelm larger vessels with sheer numbers. It can fire anti-ship missiles from concealed positions along the coast, from mobile launchers that are hard to target. It can attack oil infrastructure across the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates. It can use proxies Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, militias in Iraq to widen any conflict. This is the doctrine of deterrence through denial. The message to the world: you may have superior force, but we can deny you what you want. We can turn your prosperity into scarcity. We can transform your stability into chaos. We can make the price of attacking Iran higher than you are willing to pay. And we are willing to suffer, are trained to suffer, are culturally prepared to suffer in ways that you are not. And now, in 2026, that doctrine has been activated. The blockade is real. The tankers are stopped. The world is paying attention. The question is, what happens next? We stand now at the end of our journey. We have traveled through 5,000 years of history, from the first farmers in the Zagros Mountains to the crisis that confronts us today. We have seen empires rise in Folam and Media, Achaemenid and Parthian, Sassanid and Safavid, Qajar and Pahlavi. We have seen religions transform Zoroastrianism giving way to Islam, Sunni giving way to Shia, the secular nationalism of the Shah giving way to the Islamic Republic. We have seen the discovery of oil and the interventions of great powers, the overthrow of Mossadegh and the revolution of 1979, the war with Iraq and the sanctions and the nuclear crisis. And what have we learned? What does this long journey through time tell us about this moment? About the blockade that has closed the Strait of Hormuz? About the 20,000 mariners stranded in the Gulf of Oman? About the global economy teetering on the edge of recession? We have learned that geography is destiny. The Strait of Hormuz, this narrow waterway, barely 21 miles across, at its narrowest point, has been a choke point of civilization for millennia. The pearls of the Gulf, harvested by divers holding their breath. The spices of the East, carried by dhows across the Indian Ocean. The silks of China, the gold of Africa, the oil of modernity. All of it must pass through this gate. And whoever controls the gate controls the flow of wealth, the movement of history, the fate of empires. We have learned that identity is resilience. The Iranian people have endured conquest after conquest: Greek, Arab, Mongol, Turk, Afghan, British, Russian, American. Each time, they have absorbed the conquerors, transformed their cultures, preserved their language, their memory, their sense of themselves as a distinct civilization with a unique role in history. Zoroastrian fire gave way to Islamic prayer, but the Persian language endured. The Shah's secular nationalism gave way to the Mullah's Islamism, but the national pride remained. The empire has fallen many times, but the idea of Iran persists. We have learned that oil is a curse as well as a blessing. The black gold that gushed from the earth at Masjid Soliman in 1908 has brought wealth. Yes, but it has also brought foreign intervention, corruption, environmental destruction, economic distortion, and the strategic vulnerability that allows a blockade to threaten the world. It has made Iran a target. It has made the Strait a flashpoint. It has created the dependency that turns a regional conflict into a global crisis. And we have learned that the past is never past. The humiliation of 1953, the coup against Mossadegh still shapes Iranian attitudes toward the United States, still justifies the regime's hostility, still resonates in the rhetoric of the Revolutionary Guard commanders who now patrol the Strait. The support for Saddam in the 1980s still breeds distrust. The sanctions, the assassinations, the threats, these accumulate in collective memory, creating a narrative of victimhood and resistance that justifies, in the minds of many Iranians, the current crisis. But we have also seen something else. We have seen the creativity of a young population, hungry for connection with the world. We have seen the courage of women demanding equality, of students seeking knowledge, of artists creating beauty despite censorship. We have seen the brilliance of scientists, the skill of engineers, the humor of comedians, the passion of athletes. We have seen the ordinary humanity of a people who, despite everything, the sanctions, the repression, the isolation, find ways to live, to love, to hope. The blockade will end, somehow. It cannot last forever. The global economy cannot tolerate the disruption. The pressure for a settlement will become unbearable. There will be negotiations, compromises, perhaps a new agreement. Perhaps, dare we hope, a new beginning, a recognition that Iran is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a nation to be engaged. That the security of the strait cannot be achieved by force alone. That the only lasting solution is one that addresses the legitimate interests and security concerns of all parties. Or perhaps the answer is more modest. Perhaps it is simply to understand, to recognize that the crisis of this moment is not an aberration, not the result of a single leader's madness or a single policy's failure, but the product of 5,000 years of history, of geography and empire, of religion and revolution, of oil and great power rivalry, of memory and grievance and hope. We began this documentary with an image, a satellite photograph of a narrow waterway, captured 48 hours ago. A thin ribbon of water that has brought the world to its knees. Look at it again. See not just a choke point, see not just a strategic vulnerability. See history. See the accumulated weight of 5,000 years of human striving, of empire and faith, of trade and war, of ordinary people living their lives on the land that borders this water. See Cyrus the Great, establishing the First World Empire. See the merchants of the Silk Road, carrying treasures across continents. See the Safavid Shah, expelling the Portuguese. See the oil workers at Masjid Soliman, watching the black gold gush forth. See the revolutionaries of 1979, toppling a dynasty. See the young people of Tehran today, dreaming of a future they cannot yet imagine. The Strait of Hormuz is not merely a geographical feature. It is a testament to the enduring power of place. It is a reminder that, in our interconnected world, we remain bound by geography, by history, by the choices of those who came before us. It is a challenge to find a way forward that honors the past without being imprisoned by it, that recognizes legitimate interests without appeasing aggression, that understands that in a world of finite resources and infinite aspirations, the narrow places that choke the straits, the gates will always be contested, always be vital, always be worth understanding. The sun is setting now over the strait. The tankers lie at anchor, their holds full of oil, their crews waiting. The patrol boats of the Revolutionary Guard move through the twilight, their guns trained on the horizon. And in Tehran, in Isfahan, in Shiraz, in Tabriz, in 1,000 villages and towns across the ancient land, the Iranian people are living their lives, praying, working, loving, dreaming, connected to this crisis, and yet separate from it. Actors in a drama they did not write but cannot escape. Heirs to a civilization that has endured for 5 millennia and will endure long after the current crisis has passed into history. The gate stands open, or it stands closed. It depends on us, on our understanding, our choices, our willingness to see beyond the immediate crisis to the deeper currents of history that have brought us to this moment. The Strait of Hormuz has been the world's crossroads for 5,000 years. It will remain so for 5,000 more. The only question is, what kind of world will flow through it?